I'm Eric Deakins, and with my colleague Nigel Spearing, we're going to build on what we've said already about British entry into the European Common Market in the early 1960s by going back to the debate in the House of Commons on the issue of principle of whether or not Britain should join. That debate lasted 6 days in 1971, in October 1971. Over 200 members wanted to take part in the debate because it was so contentious and so important that the government had to allot a lot of time for the debate. I don't think in my time in the House there's ever been a debate lasting 6 days on an issue of such importance. And before even the Prime Minister, Edward Heath, opened the debate on the issue of principle as to whether Britain should join the common market, my friend Nigel Spearing had already asked him a question about the issue of sovereignty and whether or not the issue of which domestic issues would be lost to the powers of the European community had been raised at all, and were they made known to Parliament and the public. And in particular, my friend asked Edward Heath, he is asking us to sign a form before he is prepared to show us the small print, which I think sums up the way in which the House of Commons, even in those days, was treated by the Conservative government of the day on this most important issue of principle. They were being asked to vote for an issue of principle without knowing all the nitty-gritty detail which would enable them to make a truly informed decision.
Well, my friend Eric Deakins, who was there with me at the time, very kindly has read that out. It was great good fortune because we have a sort of a draw as to who shall ask the Prime Minister questions. And I put in to do so and asked him the question which just Eric has said. For this reason, that this was the day we were starting this series of debates which lasted over 60 hours in total within about 4 or 5 days. Much of it into the night and going through to the early hours of the morning on at least one occasion. But we knew, those of us who were against the proposal, not because we were not internationalists, but because we were. And we could see this was more of a party political and on the side of capital as against the side of cooperation and real international, a common market for capital too, real international cooperation, that of all parties we were against it. Many people in both parties, and indeed, as Eric has just said, it was people of both parties who were opposed, maybe for different reasons, and people of both parties, main parties, that were for. The Liberals went thither and thither, and indeed they joined later with the Social Democrats, who were some Labour people who wanted to go through it. So we were all cross-party at the same time, and that's why this debate was important. But it was important not only because of the length of time, but the motion that it was there which was carried. Meanwhile, that we enjoyed in principle, we agreed in principle to join on the terms negotiated. Here it is, and it was moved, and I think Eric will now got the actual quote. It was moved by the then Foreign Secretary and said, on principle, to join the European communities on the basis of the arrangements which have been negotiated. But I mean, what wider can you get than arrangements? It wasn't even the terms. The arrangements, which are even wider than anything which is written down. And that was, in our view, not only a deceit, but showed out what many of us were against the whole episode, by saying that it was mounted on a false criteria because it wasn't international at all, because it was increasing competitiveness, because that was the rule of the EU. It was an area of competition. Competition was actually built in to the constitution of this body. You had to have it. That was what it was for. And whilst many of us on both sides of the House wanted to see a degree of competition, one party more than another, and one party in the middle who wanted a mixture of both, we didn't want to be told by people outside what that rule should be. And yet this motion, where everybody could have a go, oh yes, you can have, everybody will be able to speak if we all ration the time in this time, and virtually that happened. It was in fact done without the detail. And that's what happened for the period of that time.
Yes, it is really a mockery of democracy to ask the nation's representatives in Parliament to approve something where they don't know the details of what it is they are being asked to approve. They were being asked to approve a principle without knowing all the details of what accepting that principle would involve. And this, I'm afraid, was one of the deficiencies of the Conservative government's approach on this issue in 1971. Subsequently, they produced a bill for debate in Parliament to ensure that British law took account of all that had been negotiated by the Prime Minister and his colleagues. And that bill itself was restrictive because those who took part in its debates and in the important committee stage on that bill were debarred from moving amendments on major issues of principle, since the House had already approved those issues, so-called, in this debate in 1971, October.
And I got here Eric's actual few statements which Eric made on that debate. On the 20th of January 1972, in his early part of his speech, he said, my friend here, the exceptional nature of this treaty lies not only in its wide-ranging provisions, but in the fact that it is a treaty without an end. Well, he meant without an end. It could go on and on and on, as indeed it has. We're even up to Lisbon going through the capitals of Europe now. It's gone on for that time. It's going more and more, closer and closer, ever closer union. That's what the Treaty of Rome said. Now I continue what he said. It is a treaty which we are supposed to be signing forever and ever. That in itself is an exceptional circumstance. I would say it's unique. Then he went on to say, we have a constitutional principle that no parliamentarian no parliament can bind its successor. Of course it can't, otherwise you haven't got a democracy. Are there not here the seeds of a potential constitutional conflict between the needs of a future parliament in the interests of the British people, as it might interpret them, and the fact that a previous government have committed the country in perpetuity by signing a treaty which has no time limit? And not only that, of course, one with pretty stiff rules at that. And he finished, we need clarification of this fundamental point before the treaty is signed. But of course we didn't get the terms at all. That's what Eric and I and others in that long debate around January 1972 were saying. So it wasn't as though there was a degree of warning of what was going on. There was. But for various reasons, the government and other people whose immediate advantages they thought was theirs were actually making not an opposite case, but were making excuses and to some extent deluding the voting public.
During this major debate in October 1971, in which many members of the House of Commons on both sides took part, about British entry into the European common market, some mention was made, but was soon forgotten because there was so much else to discuss, about what the Conservative position had been in the general election of 1970. They had put out a statement in their election literature and in their election manifesto, saying that our commitment is to negotiate, neither more nor less. They did not say our commitment is, if we secure advantageous terms, as they saw them, to enter into the common market without any further consultation with the British people. And I think that the British people, or a lot of them, were misled by this reassuring statement, which in fact turned out to be absolutely meaningless.
But it's worse than that, and Eric has put his finger absolutely on the spot. Because when it came to the big debate which he has mentioned, which lasted a week, 60 hours, and a definitive vote at the end, which was carried on a mixed party basis.
By a majority of 112.
The majority was of course only there, but nobody had actually heard what the terms and the agreement was. So the whole thing, if it had been a financial matter, would have been an actionable fraud, and it was a constitutional fraud. It was a con on our British Constitution, and a con on Parliament, and a con on the public, and it was a surrender of the powers of the Crown to what amount it turned out to be a quasi-central government of a Central European state, or a Western European state. And that's what it turned out to be, and that's what it still is.
I think that the debate in October 1971 on the issue of principle of British entry was certainly a fraud on the British public, but it also represented, I think, and this is very important in the light of subsequent events to remember, it represented a surrender by virtually the whole of the British establishment, I'm not just talking about politicians here, to the idea that Britain's future, come what may, depended on being part of a West European economic and potentially political union, that Britain could no longer throw its weight around in the world or exercise influence, to be more polite, without being a member of this union. And therefore, those who supported entry in both parties were imbued, obsessed with the idea that this was the only way ahead for Britain. Regardless, and they did recognise some of them, there would be some disadvantages, but for them the overwhelming advantage was that we would be a member of a large trading bloc, which could become even more powerful in the course of time, as it's tried to do in the last 30 or 40 years, and that would help British influence throughout the world. I happen to disagree with that point of view profoundly. I've never been a member of the establishment, but that was generally the view of people on the right and on the left in British politics who saw this as an opportunity for regaining the sort of influence which Britain had tried to exercise before the Second World War and subsequently lost.
But unfortunately, if I can add to that very astute summing up, is that it was even worse than that, because it was portrayed as a European community. And the word community in all our language is largely local, or one where people are not communists. Oh no, because there was of course, big difference between the free enterprise and democratic approach of the West and the threat, which was much stronger then, from the East, from Comecon and the other political groupings. And the so-called Cold War hadn't warmed up by that stage. So there was that in it. But what I think was worse was that there was a thing called the European movement, which we haven't mentioned. Now, I was part of that in action, as I've mentioned, when I went to help do a bit of rebuilding in bombed Hamburg and keep in touch with German friends. But the other form of community, European Economic Community, was one of rules and competition. And so the whole of the language and the whole of the way things were being put across was not only wrong, but I was thought against the principles of sound democracy itself. Now, can I go on to the next end of the con, which was perhaps constitutionally even more blatant, but in terms of what constitution we had at the time, but hardly recognised now, but shows the extent to which, over this period of a year or so, or more, the Heath administration, and he as a soldier in the Second World War, ought to have known better as a political leader. A very strange and interesting man, but I won't go further than that. As to what happened on the 20th of January, when we had another debate relating to the treaty itself, because the negotiations took place, first of all between the applicants and themselves, then in secret between the applicants and the representatives of the European Community or Union, which were largely its officials from the Commission. Certainly they were very strong there, as well as the officials of the Union itself. And then that was done in private with those together. And then, of course, in private between our own Foreign Secretary and our own government for any things that would apply only to Britain. So it was all done behind the scenes to start with. Then we come to this interesting debate of the 20th of January 1972, when the Labour opposition, and this time the minister, the shadow minister responsible, the late Peter Shaw, who even people on other sides of the House, I think, saw him as a man of coming help and integrity. But he died, unfortunately, not very long afterwards, to the great loss of both East London, where he was an adjacent member of Parliament to myself, but also to Parliament and to Western democracy itself. But he was then the spokesman for the then opposition against Ted Heath's government. On the 20th of January 1972, he then moved a party motion, or it was an opposition motion in this case, where he said, recognising the unique character of the treaty, this House calls upon Her Majesty's government not to sign the Treaty of Accession to the European Economic Community until the full text has been published and its contents laid before the House for its consideration.
Nothing could be more simple than that, or you'd have thought more justified, that the House of Commons, the Supreme Parliament in the United Kingdom, should have the texts of what it was supposed to be agreeing to before it took a decision. Otherwise, it was in part like signing a blank cheque.
But that had already happened once in the weeks-long debate which we've already described, where they didn't do it when they should have done, right at the beginning, and when Ted Heath said to me, or I said to Ted Heath, you're asking us to sign by agreeing with the agreements which you've said over this whole long week, and you haven't told us what they are. That's almost actionable, isn't it, in civil law? Anyway, there we are. But we now must go on a bit to the 20th of January. We were talking about the previous year just then, but we're now on to January, when Peter Shaw moved the motion, which I think I've just read, and we've just done a little diversion. And he said, I take up straight away the point by the member for South Angus, Bruce Gardine, about the fisheries, and so it went on. But the point about this debate was that the treaty, of course, had been drawn up. It was there somewhere in Brussels. And the first person who would actually see it as a member of Parliament, as far as we know, was when the Prime Minister went across on the day to sign it in Brussels. I mean, looking back on it, it is extraordinary that he got away with it at the time. Eric spoke in that debate, and I'll quote what he said on the 20th of January 1972. I have a constitutional principle that no Parliament shall bind its successor. Are there not here the seeds of a potential constitutional conflict between the needs of a future Parliament and the interests of the British people as it might interpret them, and the fact that a previous government had committed the country in perpetuity? by signing a treaty which has no time limit, we need clarification of this fundamental point before the treaty is signed. Following up the point he made much earlier. And there's no real answer to that, other than the people to say there was a technical matter about what was called the Ponsonby Rule, but I won't go into that because it's a bit complex. But even under the rule that had existed, introduced by Lord Ponsonby back in the 20s, that there was a surveillance of the text of a treaty by a select committee or by Parliament itself before it was ratified. The government got away with that by saying, this isn't for ratification. For ratification, we've got to have a bill later on, then you can decide it all. This is only for the signature, which in constitutional practice of international practice, as indeed it was, the government signed that it was their application, but they could not ratify it until their Parliament, or their dictator, whoever it happened to be, with us it was the Parliament, agreed with the final terms of the treaty by ratification. So the government then said, oh no, to Peter Shaw and Parliament at the time, and Eric also speaking on that debate, by saying, oh no, we can't do it, we've got to sign it, but you'll have another chance later with the bill, which we're not going to discuss tonight, but it came later on, and of course it was only got through by about 8 or 6 or one way or the other in a following year. That again was part of the continuing locking together a chains not of accountability, but a chain of deceit and surrender of British sovereignty of the Crown and people to the powers of the EU. And that was passed. The government wouldn't agree to that. They hadn't published something which the Prime Minister was going to sign the next day, flying to Brussels to do it. Oh no, they wouldn't do that. So the government, this was what was called a supply day motion, where the opposition had the right to move that motion, which they did. That's why Peter Shaw, on behalf of the Labour opposition, was moving it. And anybody who even supported going in could hardly say nay to that sensible suggestion. But the government then moved an amendment. The government then moved an amendment against that. And that was what the vote was about. And I'll read the amendment here, because it's rather interesting what they said. The government moved an amendment to that, and they said that they would, I've got the wording but not quite here in the right page, but the amendment was that they wouldn't do it now, but they would do it after it had been signed. And a vote took place on that, and the amendment was agreed to, that the treaty would be presented to the House after signature, not before, and the government won by 21 votes. I think again, that was a compounding the total deceit, both in information, in presentation, and in voting, and in the debates, that the then government got away with something which has become something around a weight around the democratic neck of the United Kingdom ever since.
The government had 3 stages of notifying and gaining parliamentary approval for Britain's entry into the European Economic Community in 1971-72. On the first stage, which we already mentioned, the government said the House should vote in principle in favour, subject to arrangements which were not available in detail to members of the House of Commons when the vote was taken. That was in October 1971. Then in January 1972, the second debate which Nigel has referred to, the treaty was on the way to being signed and had certainly been drawn up. The treaty, of course, is the formal document which people sign, as distinct from arrangements on various pieces of paper, which are then put together in the treaty. The terms of the treaty were not available to members of Parliament before they were asked to vote on the principle that the treaty arrangement should be acceptable. And then finally, you have the last parliamentary stage, which is the introduction of a bill, the European Communities Bill in 1971, where the details were at last known, but then the authorities of the House, the chairman of Ways and Means in particular, who controlled what sort of amendments could be taken and what could not be, decided that, and I'm sure this was done after consultation with the government of the day, that certain amendments on matters of broad principle were not appropriate to consider in the context of the bill. Other amendments could be, and there are many amendments, but on certain major issues of principle, because a treaty had been signed, it was not possible for the Chair of Ways and Means, and therefore for the House of Commons, to debate such amendments, because they would have been ruled out of order. And that was what 8 hours of points of order in 1970 on the first day were all about. And so the House was deprived at every one of three opportunities, each one, of the essential information to enable it to proceed. Now that brings me, and I'm sure Nigel will agree with this, up to date. When the Treaty of Lisbon was eventually signed last year, or do we go back to 2006? But at any rate, the one that the Irish turned down in their referendum last year, when that was signed, that treaty was just by the skin of the government's teeth made available to the House of Commons in the vote office just 3 or 4 hours before the major debate was going to begin. So again, they tried to get away with depriving members of the House of Commons of the most essential, basic information to enable members to be informed, fully informed, when taking a major decision of principle.
Well, thank you, Eric, for that. I think that brings us to a very good conclusion, and I have to pay tribute to my friend for all the work that he did, as you say, what he did during the debates, and the fact that without him and without the discussions which we've had together prior to this little production, it would not have been possible, because it is only by the stimulation of our conversations that I've had with him and with others, but principally with Eric and occasionally with David Stoddart. There were 3 of us still active in this area who were active during this period, and I have to thank him and all those who've been very helpful in promoting and carrying out this particular presentation, wherever it finds its elf in the end, and whoever has been watching. Thank you very much.
Thank you.